Well, that was tough to watch as the Sharks go home for Game 5, series tied at 2 against the St. Louis Blues, a situation they were in against the Colorado Avalanche. And in that Game 5, they managed to win 2-1 in what was a rather dominant game that the score only remained close due to the Avalanche goaltending. And in this one, we get the complete opposite effect as the Blues win 5-0 in what was probably, you could definitely argue, was the Sharks' worst game of these playoffs. I would say the Sharks' worst game since Game 3 against the Golden Knights, but again, the argument is strong otherwise, as this game's first period didn't start off that poorly. It didn't seem like after the first 20 minutes that this game would go in this direction, as the Sharks controlled the majority of the pace and possession in this first period. And so even though the Blues only got 4 shots, although, to be fair to the Blues, on those 4 shots were mostly good chances, honestly enough, and they had the only goal in that first period, unfortunately, for the Sharks, as it was Sundqvist burying it off of a Karlsson turnover. And so in what was a decently solid first period for the Sharks, in continuation from the decently solid second and third periods they had in Game 4, they were trailing 1-0. But this is where it all just turned terrible for the Sharks, as in the first 6 minutes of the second period, the Blues had 15 shots. And in normal situations where there are a short period of time with a ton of shots, it's normally somewhat inflated by maybe one player took like 4 swings at a puck in front of the net that the goaltender only had to make 4 very similar saves on. But in this situation, it really did just seem the Blues were all over it, and that 15 shots weren't really that inflated. The Sharks were just completely lost. This was probably the best 6 minutes played by any team during this series, and it was played by the Blues. They did get 1 goal from that, which was Jaden Short's first of his hat trick in this game. As the Sharks began to stabilize a bit in the next couple of minutes, they end up also taking a tripping penalty on Tarasenko on a breakaway, which gives him a penalty shot. And if there's a player on the Blues who you don't want to give the penalty shot to, look no further than Tarasenko, as he comes in, buries a perfect shot, top shelf, 0 chance for Martin Jones on that one, and the Blues have a 3-0 lead. And again, as the Sharks do manage to stabilize in the second period, it's not like they turn it on its head and start playing their game. They're just basically playing just normal, I guess, hockey. Right? Like the Blues, felt like more not that the Sharks stabilized, but that the Blues sort of stopped pushing as hard. And so the rest of the second period finished off with a few chances, a few shots here or there, but really nothing major in terms of chances for the Sharks. And at the start of the third period, the Sharks are down 3-0, and we saw Game 7 against the Golden Knights. The Sharks were down 3-0 early in the third period after Pacioretty's goal. And in that one, it felt like the Sharks deserved better during the first 40 minutes. The Sharks just didn't really get the bounces going their way. The Golden Knights did get the bounces going their way. And so while it wasn't, guaranteed the Sharks were going to come back in that game, you felt like it was a possibility, and the players probably felt like it was a possibility as well. In this game, however, coming into that third period, it really felt like the players were just trying to kill off the clock, and that's how I felt as well, because the Sharks had shown basically nothing during the second period. And honestly, while they did have possession-wise in the first period, a decent period, there weren't really that many good chances on the Binnington otherwise. And so this was just a bad game all around, mostly, for the San Jose Sharks, as they end up giving up another couple of goals in the third period as they completely lose their composure, giving multiple penalties. I think the Blues had a couple of 5-on-3s even in this period, and they lose 5-0. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones, who all in all probably had a pretty decent game here tonight. He actually made a lot of very big saves for the Sharks to keep them alive when, the game was, I guess, in reach. And the Sharks basically did him 0 favors. And so the last person you're going to blame on this team is probably Martin Jones. However, that doesn't excuse him completely, as in theory you could make an argument that this game maybe doesn't go this way if Jones is better on the first couple of goals. So the Sundqvist one, as I said, a terrible Erik Karlsson giveaway. Brendan Dillon has his head in the clouds, and then Karlsson does what, for some reason, he does a lot. For whatever reason, he gives the puck away and then moves directly in front of Martin Jones to screen him. And so this is a screen shot. but it's also one you could definitely see Martin Jones making the save on, and this is the first goal of the game, so not the best to give up in terms of momentum. And then the second one by Schwartz, it's a weird one. The commentator does say that Jones's only play is to poke this one away, and in theory, in most situations, that is a fine play to do. 99 times out of 100 times, nothing bad will come of it. But in this situation, it takes maybe a bit of a bad bounce, goes straight to Jaden Schwartz, who's all alone, and is able to tap it in for the second goal of this game, which began to really put it out of reach for the Sharks, sadly enough. I felt like Jones probably could have frozen this, but again, I don't blame him all too much. Maybe he should have been more aware of Jaden Schwartz's whereabouts on the ice. But again, 99 times out of 100, poking it away with the stick makes it seem that, it is normally the correct play, honestly enough. For the rest of the goals, definitely not blaming him, and as I said, probably the last player you would blame on the Sharks for this game. Next would be the good/bad news, and the bad news doesn't necessarily come from the fact that the Sharks lose this game 5-0, because as I've said multiple times, whether or not the Sharks lose terribly in their worst game of the playoffs 5-0, or whether or not the Sharks lose a 2-1 game in a game that the Sharks dominate and it's in overtime and everything like that, it does still just count as a single loss. The Blues would be up 3-2 in the series either way, and so the major bad news comes from things that affect the series in the future, and the first thing would be Erik Karlsson. He tried to go tonight. He played his usual minutes in the first period, but in the second minutes, they sort of weaned him off a bit, and then in the third period, he just didn't play at all, so it seems as though Karlsson maybe isn't at 100%, or a lot lower than 100% than he was at before, as before we knew he was below 100%, but now it's a lot below it, and it's certainly a wonder what will happen in Game 6. I guess it's nice that this was an afternoon game, so he'll get a half day extra to rest, but some people were suggesting maybe Tim Heed should start as like a seventh defenseman just in case. I could see that situation, and so many people have been calling the Sharks like lucky in these playoffs, but I think the biggest piece of bad luck for the Sharks at this point has been Erik Karlsson. He's been injured these entire playoffs, and it's so sad to imagine just how different the playoffs could have gone for the Sharks if Karlsson actually was playing at his best of his abilities. For instance, the Game 7 and the Game 7s against the Golden Knights and the Avalanche, in which people say the Sharks got lucky calls in, you can imagine that maybe those Game 7s wouldn't even exist if Erik Karlsson was playing at 100% and he didn't get injured right before the playoffs. So it is unfortunate to imagine a situation like that. Hopefully Karlsson gets a bit of extra rest, and him not playing in that third period is good for him, as maybe DeBoer took him out for somewhat precautionary reasons, and he's at least somewhat good to go for Game 6, as he's going to be key in being able to come back in this series. Other bad news would be Joe Pavelski, but I think that is also precautionary a bit, as his injury was in the third period when the game was basically out of reach, and so taking him out maybe, hopefully, doesn't actually re-aggravate the injury he sustained in Game 7 against the Golden Knights. Again, mostly just hoping at that point. And then the third injury in this game that could be bad news is Tomas Hertl, as the Blues, for the second time in this series, get away with a clear headshot. This time it's Ivan Barbashev. We'll see if the league spins the wheel and it lands on a suspension. Who knows if that will actually occur, but I don't believe Hertl played after the first period, if I'm not mistaken. He definitely didn't have a lot of ice time, and hopefully that's not too bad going forward. If it is a concussion, it's pretty hard to play through a concussion, because it's not something that you can sort of just like numb, or like a broken thumb or something. You could just numb that and maybe play through it, but a concussion is a lot more difficult because it's a head injury. Hopefully the Blues get some league discipline from that, but with the fact that they completely ignored the Sammy Blais hit onto Justin Braun, who knows if that's going to be the case. But the good news for the Sharks, as I said, besides the fact that this terrible loss only counts as one loss in the series, is that even though they're down 3-2 here, it's not unheard of for teams to come back from down 3-2, and especially in these playoffs, we have seen it multiple times. For instance, the Hurricanes, in an opposite situation that the Sharks are in, down 3-2 against the Capitals in the first round, won Game 6 at home and then won Game 7 on the road to move on to the second round, ended up sweeping the Islanders, by the way, after that. The St. Louis Blues, the team involved in this series, or one of the teams involved in this series, were down 3-2 to the Stars after Game 5, won Game 6 on the road, and then won Game 7 at home, so an identical situation that the Sharks are in as well. And then the Sharks themselves not only went the extra mile from the fact that they were down 3-1 in the series against the Golden Knights. But if you just take into account the fact that the Sharks have the victory in Game 5, they were down 3-2 to the Golden Knights in an identical situation, having to win on the road in Game 6 before going back for the Game 7 at home, and the Sharks did it there. So this is an unscouted territory for the Sharks. They know what it takes to come back, and the Golden Knights are just as good of a team as the St. Louis Blues, and while the Sharks are obviously laboring here, and there's a lot of injuries that they are dealing with, so that does make it tougher than how they were maybe a bit more fresh against the Golden Knights. Again, it's not impossible to come back from down 3-2, so it's not all bleak news for the San Jose Sharks just yet. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday for their 5th elimination game of these playoffs, Game 6 against the St. Louis Blues. If they can win that, they will be back for their 3rd consecutive Game 7 in these playoffs back in San Jose. It's not unheard of, as you just have to look back to 2014 when the Kings went 3 Game 7s during their first 3 rounds and then ended up winning in 5 games in the Stanley Cup Finals to take the Stanley Cup. So if the Sharks have to go that route, I'm sure they'll take it as long as they can manage to get the victories, but it will be tough. St. Louis Blues haven't been the best team at home during these playoffs, and the Sharks have actually looked good in St. Louis during Game 3 and Game 4 where they were there. But of course, with the Blues the chance to close this out and head back to the Stanley Cup Finals for the first time in a long time for them, it will be a tough task to handle. Class dismissed.